The studio lights caught the moment like a photograph. Ivanka Trump's hand, 3 inches from the water glass, stopped midair. Her smile was still there, the practiced one she had worn since walking in, but it had frozen in a way that did not look like a smile anymore. It looked like a mask that had forgotten how to move. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. No triumphant lean forward, no finger pointed. Just her eyes, steady and clear, looking directly at the woman who had just asked her to name one thing. The clock on the studio wall read 3:47 in the afternoon, but time had stopped anyway. 41, that is the number that would not leave the room. 41 things that Ivanka Trump had failed to name, failed to account for, failed to acknowledge, when the only thing she had asked for was one. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. In a television studio built for noise and laughter and the chaos of cable news, 11 seconds is an eternity. The hum of the lights seemed to grow louder. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone coughed and then stopped, as if the sound had been swallowed by what was happening in front of the cameras. But to understand how Ivanka Trump ended up frozen in that chair with her hand, 3 inches from a glass of water she would never pick up, we have to go back to the moment she walked in thinking she had already won. The green room at CNN had the feel of two separate worlds sharing the same air conditioning. On one side of the hallway, the producers moved in quick, efficient bursts, clipboards, earpieces, the silent language of a broadcast about to go live. On the other side, the guests waited. Ivanka Trump arrived 40 minutes early. That was not usual for her. She had learned over years of television appearances that timing was itself a kind of message. Arrive too early and you looked nervous. Arrive too late and you looked careless. 40 minutes was the Goldilocks zone, early enough to seem professional, late enough to remind everyone that she had places to be. She wore a navy blazer with a loose thread on the left cuff. It was a small thing, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, but it was there. The costume department had not caught it, or perhaps she had chosen not to mention it. Some things were better left visible. They made you look human. Baron Trump walked a step behind her. He was 28 now, tall in the way that suggested he had not quite finished growing into his frame, with his father's posture and his mother's stillness. He carried a phone in one hand and a folder in the other, a man who had learned young to carry the weight of things. "This is a simple interview," Ivanka said to no one in particular. "She is a congresswoman from Texas who thinks she can score points by being loud. I have done this 1,000 times." The producers heard the words. They made a note. The interview had not started yet, but the narrative was already being built and both sides knew it. Jasmine Crockett arrived 17 minutes early. She wore a cream blazer with no loose threads, small gold earrings, and glasses that caught the light when she tilted her head. She moved through the green room without the practiced glide of someone who had done 100 television appearances, and also without the anxiety of someone who had done very few. She moved like someone who understood that the room was just a room, and the cameras were just cameras, and the real work had already happened before she walked in the door. Her chief of staff walked beside her, carrying a folder of prepared materials that Jasmine had already told him she would not need. "You want me to bring it anyway?" he asked. "I want you to bring it and then put it away," she said. "I am not going to war with a script." The producer who met her at the door looked surprised. Most guests came with talking points and backup talking points, with numbers memorized and statistics rehearsed. Jasmine Crockett came with nothing except a quiet confidence that the room could feel before she said a single word. "She is going to try to rattle you," the producer said. "Ivanka does that. She is very good at it." "I know," Jasmine said. "I have watched." "Then you know what you are walking into." Jasmine looked at the producer with the kind of clarity that made people stop talking. "I know what she is going to try to do," she said. "That is different from knowing what is going to happen." The producer nodded. He made a note. The interview had not started yet, but the narrative was already shifting in ways that had not been anticipated. This is the part where most people click away too early. They see two women walking into a studio and they think they know how the story ends. But the story does not start when the cameras roll. It starts in the moments nobody films, the pause before the handshake, the look that passes between strangers who know they are a boo. To become opponents, the single breath that carries everything a person is thinking, and none of what they are about to say. That breath is why you keep watching. The makeup artist was finishing with Jasmine when Ivanka walked into the studio. They did not speak. This was not unusual, strangers passing in a space built for strangers, but the silence between them was not the silence of coincidence. It was the silence of two people who had decided, ahead of time, not to pretend. The studio was smaller than it looked on television. The chairs were harder than they looked on television. The lights were hotter than anyone outside the industry could understand. Every person who had ever seen a news broadcast and thought, "I could do that," had never sat under a three-point lighting rig for 45 minutes while someone asked them questions they could not rehearse. Ivanka took her chair first. She adjusted the microphone on her lapel and then she adjusted it again, not because it needed adjusting, but because the motion gave her something to do with her hands. Her hands had been trained over years to project confidence. But confidence was a performance, and performances required something to do while you waited for the curtain to rise. Jasmine took her chair across the table. She did not adjust her microphone. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, left over right, and she looked at the empty chair where the host would sit, and she waited. The clock read 3:52, 5 minutes until airtime. "You know why they asked me to do this interview?" Ivanka said. She was not looking at Jasmine. She was looking at the camera, running through the angles, finding the light. Jasmine did not answer immediately. She let the question sit in the air for 3 seconds, not confrontational, not passive, just present. Then she spoke. "Why?" "Because they think this will be a fight," Ivanka said. "They think you and I will go at each other and they will get good ratings. That is what they think." "What do you think?" Ivanka's smile returned, the practiced one, the one that did not quite reach the eyes. "I think you are a congresswoman who has been in office for 2 years and you have not done anything anyone can point to. I think you have a title but no record. And I think when this interview is over, people are going to remember that I asked you a simple question and you could not answer it." Jasmine nodded slowly. "That is what you think." "That is what I know." The studio lights flickered. The countdown started in the producer's earpiece. 5, 4, 3. The host walked in and took his chair. The interview began the way most cable news interviews begin, with a question designed to sound neutral while being anything but. "Ivanka, you have been a constant presence in your father's political operation for over a decade now," the host said. "You have been in the White House, you have been on the campaign trail, you have been at the center of some of the most consequential political moments in recent memory. And Congresswoman Crockett, you have been one of the most vocal critics of the Trump family's involvement in politics. Let me start with this. Why are we here? What are we really talking about tonight?" Ivanka leaned forward. The light caught her blazer. The loose thread was visible now if you knew where to look. "We are here because my father built something extraordinary," she said. "And there are people in this country who cannot stand to see it. They call it chaos. They call it controversy. But what they are really calling it is success, because success is the thing they cannot forgive." She turned to Jasmine. The movement was smooth, rehearsed, deliberate. "And Congresswoman Crockett, I have a simple question for you. One question. Can you name one policy, one achievement, one moment where your time in Congress has made a single person's life better? One thing." The room went quiet. This was the setup. This was the trap, laid clean and simple, designed to make Jasmine either defend herself with a list, which would sound defensive, or admit she had nothing, which would sound like a concession. The host waited. The camera lingered on Jasmine's face. 23 seconds passed. Jasmine did not flinch. She did not launch into a defense. She sat in the silence and she let it breathe, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, calm, almost gentle. "You want one thing," she said. "One thing," Ivanka repeated. "Okay," Jasmine said. "But before I give you that one thing, I want to give you 41. The word landed like a stone in still water. 41. The host leaned forward. 41. "One thing per year of my legal career before I came to Congress," Jasmine said. 41 cases I argued before federal courts. 41 people whose lives were changed because the system worked for them when it was not supposed to. Tax fraud cases. Housing discrimination cases. Voting rights cases. A case that went all the way to the Fifth Circuit that established precedent for how courts handle voter suppression in Texas." She paused, not for effect, for memory. "A 73-year-old woman in Houston who was about to lose her home because a company had falsified documents. I got her case dismissed. She kept her home. She kept her home because the system worked for her, and it should not have, and it almost did not. Ivanka's hand moved toward the water glass. It stopped 3 inches away. A young father in Dallas who was wrongly accused of fraud by his employer. He was facing prison time. I got the charges dropped. He saw his daughter's 8th birthday. The silence in the studio had a texture now. It was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of recognition, the kind that happens when someone says something true and the room realizes it has been waiting to hear it. 41 families, Jasmine said. 41 people who are still in their homes, still with their children, still standing because the law worked the way it is supposed to work. That is one thing. That is one career. That is what I did before I walked into a congressional office, and that is what I carry with me every time I walk into one now. Ivanka's hand was still frozen in the air. Can I name them? Jasmine asked, not rhetorically, actually asking. The host did not speak. No one spoke. 11 seconds. Then Jasmine began. She did not rush. That was the thing that the room noticed, the thing the cameras caught. She did not rush through the names like someone reading a list to get to the end. She took her time. Each name came with a brief context, a moment of recognition, a small window into what that person's life had looked like before Jasmine walked into it and what it looked like after. The room heard about the grandmother in Fort Worth who had been foreclosed on by a bank that could not prove it owned her mortgage. The room heard about the teenager in San Antonio whose criminal record was expunged after Jasmine proved the arresting officer had falsified the report. The room heard about the small business owner in El Paso who had been locked out of a government contract because of paperwork errors that had nothing to do with him. By the time she reached number 27, Ivanka had lowered her hand. She was no longer reaching for the water glass. She was no longer looking at the camera. She was looking at Jasmine, and the look on her face was not the look of someone who was losing a debate. It was the look of someone who had just seen something they had not expected to see and did not know how to respond to. The silence at the 16-minute mark lasted 9 seconds. The studio lights hummed. The camera caught the way Ivanka's jaw had tightened. The way her blazer, the one with the loose threads, seemed, in that moment, less like a costume and more like something she was wearing because she did not know what else to do. This is the part most people miss because they leave too early. The story is not about who wins. The story is about what happens when someone refuses to play the game you set up for them and shows up with something you did not prepare for. The story is about the moment when the trap becomes a mirror. Jasmine reached number 41. A woman in Austin, she said. Single mother, 3 children. She was a defendant in a case brought by the state of Texas alleging welfare fraud. The state was wrong. I proved they were wrong. The charges were dropped. She is a paraeducator now. She helps children with disabilities. Her name is Deborah. Jasmine looked at Ivanka. Deborah is not a policy, she said. She is not an achievement. She is a person. And she is the one thing you asked me for. She is one of 41. The room did not move. Ivanka opened her mouth and then closed it. This was not a technique. This was not a strategy. This was a woman who had walked into a room with a plan and watched the plan become irrelevant in real time. The host looked at Ivanka. Do you want to respond? Ivanka's hands were flat on the table. Her fingers were still. For someone who had spent years controlling every gesture in every room she entered, the stillness was the most visible thing about her. I think what Congresswoman Crockett is describing is admirable, she said. The words came out carefully, slowly, like she was testing each one before she let it go. Her legal career sounds like it was meaningful. I do not doubt that. But, Jasmine said, not aggressively, just asking. Ivanka looked at her. But that is not what this election is about, she said. This is about my father and what he built and what he can do for this country. That is the conversation. That is the choice. Jasmine nodded. She did not argue. She did not attack. She simply repeated back what Ivanka had just said. Your father, she said, that is the choice. Yes. That is what this is about. Yes. Jasmine leaned forward just slightly. The light caught her glasses. Ivanka, she said, you walked in here and you asked me to name one thing. One. You wanted me to give you a single piece of evidence that I have done anything with my time in public service. And when I gave you 41, you did not ask me about any of them. You did not ask about Deborah. You did not ask about the grandmother in Fort Worth. You did not ask about any of the 41 people whose lives I have been part of changing. She paused. You told me that was not what this election is about. You told me the conversation is about your father. The room was very quiet. You asked me to name one thing, Jasmine said. And I think what you were really asking is, why should anyone listen to me instead of you? Ivanka's face did not change. And my answer is not 41 legal cases, Jasmine said. My answer is not a list of names or a record of rulings or a collection of victories in courtrooms most people will never see. My answer is simpler than that. She held Ivanka's gaze. I listen. When people come to me with their problems, I listen. When Deborah came to me, I listened. When the grandmother in Fort Worth came to me, I listened. I do not decide what is important before they finish speaking. I do not tell them that their problem is not what the election is about. I listen, and then I do something about it. The mirror moment had arrived. Not because it wins elections, Jasmine said. Not because it plays well on television, but because those 41 people showed up in my life and trusted me with something that mattered to them, and that trust is the only thing I have ever tried to be worthy of. Ivanka did not speak. The silence at the 23-minute mark lasted 12 seconds. The studio lights hummed. The clock on the wall read 4:14. Somewhere in the back of the room, a phone buzzed and the sound was immediately silenced. The interview did not end with a dramatic exit or a pointed closing statement. Ivanka answered the host's final question about her father's platform with a response that was practiced and smooth and completely empty of the energy that had filled the room for the previous 20 minutes. She thanked the host. She stood up. She walked out of the studio without looking back. Baron Trump followed her. The folder he had carried in was still closed in his hand. The host turned to Jasmine. Congresswoman, final thoughts. Jasmine was quiet for a moment. The studio lights were still on. The cameras were still rolling. The room was still full of the weight of what had just happened. Most people who come to me do not have anyone else to go to, she said. That is the thing I think people forget. The 41 people I talked about today, they did not come to me because I was the best option. They came to me because everyone else had said no. Because the system had told them they did not matter. Because the people in power had decided their problems were not worth solving. She looked at the camera. If I have done anything worth remembering, it is not the cases. It is the decision to pay attention when everyone else looked away. That is all I have. That is all I have ever had. The host thanked her. The cameras stopped rolling. Jasmine sat in her chair for a moment after the lights went down. The studio was quiet. The hum of the equipment had a different quality now, softer, like the room was exhaling. The folder her chief of staff had brought sat unopened on the table. The story of what happened in that studio is not a story about winning. Jasmine Crockett did not defeat Ivanka Trump in the way that word is usually used in politics. There was no knockout blow. There was no moment where one side admitted failure and the other claimed victory. What happened was simpler and harder to explain. A woman walked into a room with a trap and a smile and a plan. She set the trap. She waited for the spring. And then she watched as the person across the table opened her mouth and said something that made the trap irrelevant, not by attacking it, not by dismantling it, but by showing up with something the trap had never been designed to catch. The 41 people were not a counterattack. They were not a debate strategy. They were a life, a career, a way of being in the world that Ivanka Trump had never had to understand because she had never needed to. And in that moment, in that studio, with the cameras off and the lights going dark, the question was not who had won the interview. The question was what it meant to listen when no one else would. The question was what it meant to show up for people who had no one else to show up for them. The question was 41. And the silence after the question was the kind of silence that stays with you. This is the community that keeps coming back, the one that understands the difference between a fight and a conv. Arsation between a win and a truth, between the person who shows up with a plan and the person who shows up with something harder to explain. The story is not over. It never is. But this chapter is done and the next one is waiting whenever you are ready for it.